Fatemeh Keshavarz, Jasmine stars, but by contract, I'm obligated to tell you about our next event, which is a jazz concert on Friday, March 13th at 7:30 p.m. in the Memoirs by Peter Solly and Ray Hobbs, who are alumni of Hong College. But Dr. Keshavarz is the author of Jasmine Stars, you know, Lolita in Tehran, a book that touched me very deeply at both the intellectual as well as the level of, I guess for lack of a better word, heart. It brought back memories of growing up in Pakistan, and even though she shares her memories of Iran in many ways, I felt like she had written a book that did justice to my memories about my homeland as well. And since then, I had wanted to invite her to come and speak at Marlborough and share some of her thoughts in person, and want to thank her for coming here and being so generous as to spend an entire class in Introduction to Mysticism with our students, where she generously shared her time, and then also had dinner with students, and she has been with us all day long. So this is just her generosity spirit, and thank you for that. Dr. Keshavarz is from Iran. She was born and raised in the city of Shiraz in southwest Iran. She holds a BA degree in Persian language and literature from Shiraz University, and a master's and a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from School of Oriental and African Studies, London University. Her PhD thesis won the Dunn and Wilson Award, the British Publishers Award for PhD work of distinction. She has written numerous books, one of which the talk is based on, but another recent book is called Recite in the Name of the Red Rose, Poetic Sacred Making in 20th Century Iran. And both of these texts were chosen by a Choice Magazine Award. She has lived in many different countries in the Near East and Europe, speaks Persian, Arabic, Turkish, in addition to English and French. And she's also a practicing poet, and she has been featured in national poetry festivals and has read her own poetry alongside prominent American poets such as Galway Kinnell. And she takes a lot of interest in broad public and civic issues of cultural education and world peace. And in May 2007, she was invited to speak at the UN General Assembly on the topic of world peace. She has been a guest of NPR on many occasions. And I recommend, I think perhaps Dr. Chris, and maybe we can put it up even on our website, but there are some links where her interview with Krista Tibbett speaking of faith. She did a section, a whole program on Rumi where Dr. Keshavarz was featured, and that is available online. And we'll try and provide you with the link, or if you were to just go on Speakers of Faith, you might be able to find it. And that program won the Peabody Award in April 2008. And most recently, she has been awarded the 2008 Herschel Walker Peace and Justice Award by People's Weekly. So the list goes on, and she teaches and is the chair at the Washington University in St. Louis. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Keshavarz, please.
Thank you so much for coming up here in this snowy evening, though it has stopped snowing. I can see how slippery the road is, and hopefully we'll have some nice warm discussion here. And as you see from the title, I'm going to talk about my book, but before that I'm going to thank everyone who organized this evening. Amar worked on it, Chris, and thank you all so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I had a great day talking to the students earlier, so it's all my pleasure. So, thank you. As Amar said, this is the most recent book that I published, and I will be talking to you about why I basically thought about writing this book, and what is it that I'm trying to do with this book, and where I'm heading from there. Well, basically, when this book, Reading Lolita in Tehran, came out in 2003, something really interesting happened in the months that followed, and that was if you said hi to anyone and they found out that you were Iranian or had some connection with Iran, their first question would be, have you read Reading Lolita Tehran? And there was very, very little question about the fact that the book was shaping the popular imagination about Iran and what Iran is about. So obviously, I was also curious about the book. And when I read the book, the most important thing that happened to me was that I didn't recognize the Iran I know. You know, I saw bits and pieces of things, and I have even in my book, I would like to grant for that there are instances, moments that I have no doubt the author experienced and they're out there. But what the book told me and gave me was so partial, so cropped in such a way that I could only see a very mutilated, if you like, image of what I had always experienced. And I'm very aware of the fact, as a literature person, that we all have our experiences, and they're not, you know, just because we come from the same culture, they're not necessarily identical experiences. And I'm also aware of the fact that a whole range of books have been coming out, mostly by women, in the form of memoirs that have talked about their experiences, mostly very difficult and strange and frightening experiences, and they have played a very central role in shaping the public imagination in the United States about mostly, and in this case I'm focusing on Muslim cultures, what this is about. So I started talking about writing a book, thinking about how to do that, and I'm going to kind of be spelling that out a little more in detail to you tonight. But before I do that, I want to approach something else and address something else, which is what might come to mind, which is, well, that book is a memoir. That's a personal story. And a personal story can be just anything. And why does it matter? And I think it's very important to pay attention to that and to see why there's so much power in that personal story and why it's important to take that story seriously. We understand the world that we live in through stories, basically. And in cognitive psychology, now we talk about that. As the child grows up, the fact that the mother approaches the crib means that a bottle of milk might be coming that way. That's the whole story. You know, and if the bottle doesn't come out, the story is incomplete. And so we see someone standing at the bank in line. You know, the story is this person is going to either write a check, deposit some money, or so on and so forth. We like our stories to ring true. You know, we not necessarily do scientific research on them all the time, but we really want them to feel true to us and to other people. We like our stories to be complete, because otherwise they're just, you know, like an incomplete circle that chunks, bits and pieces missing from them. And we also like our stories not to contradict each other, or the bigger stories that are usually the basic or foundational stories about a belief system. For example, if we believe in individuality and the significance of democracy and many other things that are really the big stories we rely on, we don't want our personal stories to contradict those stories. It's important to know how important these stories are. What is a story? Just get more specifically to this question. It's a person, an object, or an event that is moving in time and space. the examples that I give. Pouring a cup of coffee is a story. From the moment you pick the coffee pot and pour it into the cup, taking money from an ATM machine is a story. And then it gets to, of course, much more complicated stories of personal relationships or complex social events of our lives. The election we just experienced was a very eventful and interesting and complex story. And also, there are grand stories of our time, grand narratives of our time. And what we do with these stories, we test and affirm them when new situations arise. We have an imagination of what Iran is like because of the gradual bits and pieces that we've got, and we get reading Lolita and Tehran, and we get a lot of things affirmed because they seem to coincide in many ways and support each other. We fill in the gaps in our stories using other stories that we know, so that we could go on feeling that they're true and they're really a part of our existence, and then we project them into new situations to make sense of unknown situations. So in other words, stories are very, very important because they allow us to make sense of new situations that we come across. How accurate are our stories? Not very. The point of those stories is not accuracy. And as I said, we'd like them to ring true, we'd like them to be true. It's not that we want to falsify stories, but really facticity or factuality is not the most important aspect of those stories. Very often, the stories of our lives are about motivation, agency, happiness, fear, anticipation, fulfillment, and human needs to grow and to understand and to make sense of things. And usually the testing methods we use for our needs stories are not careful reasoning. It's not that we're going to take out a few sentences from reading Lolita and Tehran and subject it to very careful analysis. And I'm using reading Lolita and Tehran because I'm going to give you examples, and because that's the one that I am kind of using as my example, but there are very many. For example, in reading Lolita and Tehran, which I will tell you the overall line in a minute, the author who writes her memoirs is a teacher. And this author has a lot of Muslim, quote-unquote, activist extremists in her class. And one day she has an argument with a student over a book by Maxim Gorky. The student likes Gorky, the teacher likes Jane Austen. And so the author tells us that I said to this student, Mr. Naqvi, the students, I do not compare you to Elizabeth Bennet. Who's from Jane Austen. I do not compare you to Elizabeth Bennet. There is nothing of her in you, to be sure. It's a direct quote. There is nothing of her to be in you to be sure. You are as different as man and mouse. So she turns to a young Iranian student and tells him that compared to this character, you're like a mouse. And if we did careful reasoning, we would say, what's wrong with this teacher? We can't say that to your student, no matter how different they are from you. After all, they're there to explore all these differences. But by that time, we have compared Mr. Naqvi to the most fanatic, strange, frightening creatures we know. And so the mice, the underhandedness, the fact that he could infest an environment, all of that corresponds. So, the analogy is there. And very little serious, careful reasoning takes place. And precisely because the work is not a scientific piece of work, it doesn't have any claim to scientific findings. So we go over it, and we might not even pay that much, but we have grasped that story and added it to the reservoir of what we know about the world, and particularly in this case, about Iran. How much do the stories influence us? Very much. They shape our worldview. Actually, the recent brain imaging studies show that these stories create in our brains, in our feelings, the very exact same reactions that facing reality does. Now, I'm not claiming that when we read them, we don't know that they are stories. We do know that they are stories. If we were ever to forget that they are stories, the borderline between reality and fiction would be broken. And we do know that they're stories, but nonetheless, these stories, as we read them, activate parts or regions of our brain that reality does. So these texts have to be taken very, very seriously, because they do shape our worldview and influence us deeply. Basically, what I'm saying is, if alternative representations of the world do not correct our stories, if we do not give ourselves opportunities where these stories are constantly corrected and subjected to different perspectives, we will continue making them and projecting them onto our own situations, and we will be creating a world in which probably what we understand of the world would be very distant from reality. It could become very frightening, it could become isolating, it could become fun, it could become fantasy, all kinds of possibilities. But what we need are constant alternative perspectives, where we could look at things from different perspectives and correct our views. Now, of course, we have grand narratives, and these grand narratives could either challenge or affirm the stories that we know. These are two major grand narratives that are not that far from our time. Let's say in the early 19th century, the main master narrative is that the missionaries are out there to bring the world out of darkness into the light of Christianity. That's a grand narrative. You do that in order to save the world. You do it with perfectly good intentions. Whatever happens is a part of that grand narrative and gets justified. An example of that is, for example, the British missionaries in Iran constantly at the time talked about how Iranian women have no rights. They talk about the fact that, in fact, Mary Bird says, Persian language has no word for home. I don't know where she learned Persian, but because there are so many words for home, but at the time that's what she believed. Persian language has no word for home, so that's because family is not important, women are not important, they're all beasts, they're treated like animals. And that's a time where Iran, yes, of course, this is the early 19th century, mid-19th century. It's not the 21st century. There's a lot of gender inequality everywhere in the world. But, you know, for example, the Iranian women in 1853 have almost a political uprising in which they forced the king of the time to cancel an economic agreement he has made with the British, during which he's given the monopoly of tobacco plantation to this British institution. Because they break all the bubbles and they say they don't allow their husbands and fathers to smoke and themselves don't smoke, and you know, they just basically create a right. When later on the constitutional revolution takes place, women are both demonstrating on the streets, they are even fighting in the constitutional revolution. But Mary Bird says, no, they're in the darkness of Islam. And until they come into the light of Christianity, they're total slaves. So the grand narrative at the time. Later on, of course, or sometimes not that far from that, we also have the civilizational grand narrative. We are living a very powerful grand narrative we have right now in the United States is a humanitarian. We are out there to save the world from the violence and extremism of Muslims. And this doesn't mean that no violence takes place in the Muslim world, that there's nothing we need to correct, and that side is all perfect and so on. But the assumption that as long as in existential conflict with free thinking, that constantly comes up in discussion, is Islam compatible with democracy? Are Muslims able to respect human rights? One of the assumptions is that, for example, if a journal is censored in a country, and I'm not for censorship, I'd be totally against it, but if a journal is censored in Pakistan, in Iran, in Turkey, that means those people have no human rights. They're totally unable to be free thinkers or deal with issues that are important to them. But we need to be out there and do things, even if that involves physical violence, even if that involves war, even if that involves economic sanctions, which could actually be a weapon of mass destruction if it leads to a lot of death and shortage, particularly for women and children, who are usually below the poverty line in much of the world. And also, part of that narrative, Muslim women are second-class citizens. I've told people in Iran, 70% of the university students are women. And some people ask, do they have a university of their own? The assumption, the feeling that they would be in the ordinary university, forming 70% of their student population, is almost difficult because of the grand narratives that says in Iran people don't have human rights. And again, we can talk about human rights in Iran and areas in which human rights it's not perfect. It does it needs to be criticized, it needs to be reformed. But whether that means that people are unable to think for themselves, or whether the entire system is run by a single person, whether they are a danger to the region, all of these things come out of this one grand humanitarian narrative that says we have to go save them because they don't have human rights. Now, I claim in my book that there is what I call a new orientalist discourse in action. What I mean by the new orientalist discourse is that there is an old orientalist discourse, which we all who deal with the Middle East, Islam, China, Japan study. And that's studied in the 18th and 19th century, even in the 20th century. There are European philologists and literature specialists who become great scholars of language, of history, of philology, and know things about the Orient very deeply and very well. But they generalize it to every aspect of life, and they talk about the Orient almost as if it was an exotic object or exotic world that was great in the past. In present, it's almost dead, doesn't have any potential for modernization, and they would, for example, love the pre-modern Persian poetry. But if you told them that there are great modern poets, most of them wouldn't even be interested. Nothing past the pre-modern period would be of interest to them. So the Orientalist vision basically took this passion, the Muslim Eastern world, and overly generalized and also objectified it in some way, looked at it as very, very very exotic. It really, in the end, led to a kind of very selective perception of that part. Now, what I'm saying is that these memoirs, these stories of women which appear, they are a revitalization or incarnation of the same Orientalist narrative. And they give us a very selective and sensational and unnuanced notion of what the East is like. You know, it's all religion. Everyone's only concerned about religion. Or, you know, men control women and religion controls men. In a very, you know, black and white, good and evil kind of perception. And unfortunately, this new orientalist narrative is in our academic discourse. And not that not every academic thinks in those terms, but it's not as academia is free of it. I'll give you an example. Where history of Islam is taught, for example, as something really great in the past, gone down the line. Afterwards, nothing is left of it that's worth paying attention to right now. It's present in personal memoirs and travel writings. The example of the women's writings is there. Anthropological observations, social political commentary. If you could see it in all these spheres, and I'm going to give you this particular example. Bernard Lewis, a very distinguished historian of modern, not just modern, of the Middle East and Islam. And in 2002, he writes the book, What Went Wrong? Western Impact and Middle Eastern Response. And basically, he talks about the Middle East as a culture in Turkey, which is quite amazing, but from a historian of his caliber to talk about the entire Middle East as a culture. I'll tell you, you know, I'm of Iranian origin, my husband is of Turkish origin. Even traveling back and forth between the two countries, you just see such a range of difference in approaches to everything. But he talks about, you know, the entire Middle East as a culture. The book is full of errors in terms of referring to facts. He doesn't give any context when he talks about the decline of the region. It's very sensationalized. He says he gives the discrimination against women as the single most important factor in the decline of the Islamic world. And then he doesn't give us two examples of two Muslim women. All he pointed, the chapter on women is fascinating, gives us three examples. He says, this Turkish historian, Evliya Çelebi, was in Austria and in the 17th century. He saw the Austrian emperor crossing the street and holding his horse so that a woman can pass. And Evliya Çelebi, the Turkish historian, is surprised. It's just very interesting to think that an emperor with so much power and glory and he stops his horse for a woman to cross. So then Lewis decides Turkish women have no respect. This guy has no respect for Turkish women. Then he gives us an example of a Egyptian historian talking about an opera in which Egyptian princess is portrayed. And on the basis of that, he decides that in the mind of this person, Egyptian women have no respect. Then he goes to Khomeini and says, quotes a sentence by Khomeini who says, the Shah of Iran, and Khomeini did say that, the Shah of Iran put women in a very ethically wrong situations where they would go out in unacceptable outfits and so on. Khomeini thought that was his perspective on that. And then he decided that means that Iranian women have no respect for them. And the situation of women ends there. That's his explanation, which is quite amazing from a historian. If he did that kind of historical analysis on France, there will be tons of reviews written. How could you make that judgment? On the basis of three men from different backgrounds making one statement about a woman or a situation to deciding the respect or the status of women in France. But he hardly gets questioned when he says that about women. All right, so that's what this judgment, the single most society, is the status of women, and then we get, of course, to the women's memoirs that reading Lolita and Tehran is an example of what they do. They become eyewitness accounts. People like Azad who are on one level an Iranian native, they go there, they speak the language. On another level, they understand Western literature. So what Bernard Lewis does as a historian, looking at this whole situation from the outside, they almost do from within. Looking at the situation. So they have the sameness with the locals, but at the same time they have different perspective. And they do ethnography. If the orientalists in the 19th century had to do ethnography on the locals, now these women, memoir writers, do it on themselves. So it's very much giving their voices even more thought. So here's the book, Reading Lolita and Tehran. And if I may have a show of hands, how many people have read the book? Okay, for those of you who haven't read it, 7 girls and their female professors come together and read Western literature to discuss their oppression in the hands of Muslim men. And the author of the memoir talks about how they're really she's using the power of literature to revive in them resistance to this oppression, and overnight almost her memoir confirms the master narrative of human rights, which I was talking about, that it confirms the perception of the Iranian post-revolutionary society. So those 2 little young girls wearing black scarves and looking down become kind of victims. She is defending, and she's talking about how we need to give back to them or help them maybe in ways what they have lost in this society. In this emerging world, in our essays for reading Lolita and Tehran, the West equals modern, rational, and dynamic. She says that quite clearly. Americans look forward. We Iranians look back. Remember I told you these things have no accuracy? Just, why? I mean, someone can ask her, why are we Iranians? Why? First of all, how can you say that on behalf of 70 million Iranians? We look backward? No nation, I don't think you should say that about any nation, that all of it look forward or look backward. But she says it, and it rings true. The West is modern, rational, dynamic. The East is anti-modern, irrational, and static. So normally, naturally, they look backwards. Men control women, Islam controls men. Women are unable to change this. Western intervention is necessary. We see them all as from the moment you see them on the cover of the book, in these 2 black scarves looking down, to the moment that you read these heart-wrenching anecdotes of what happens to them. You don't actually hear the women talk. The anecdote is given to us by her. In fact, there are tons of us, I tell you in my book, women writing about themselves, writing about the society, even criticizing the Iranian society, at the same time that she is in Iran in the 1990s and writing a book, but they don't feature at all in her book. Not a single woman writer, woman artist, woman athlete, none. They're just the 7 girls who come to her house and they're constantly oppressed. And a couple of colleagues who get expelled from the university and so on and so on. So clearly they're helpless and they don't have a voice. Now, the author humanizes, if you look here, the author humanizes the women. We read that when they come to her apartment, they take their veil off and burst into color. It's quite interesting, because they always take their scarf off no matter where they go. They enter the house, they take it out. And they're not necessarily not wearing colors. In those instances where she's talking about, they were wearing some overcoats, and they took it out in the house when they came for reading. But this associates in the mind of the American reader who probably has never had a chance to be in touch with an Iranian who lives in Iran or know more about their way of life, that they are kind of imprisoned in the veil. They're imprisoned in the overcoat that they wear, and their individualities are covered. And only when they are in her house kind of burst into color. So the veil robs women of their individuality. She tells that us all the time. Never mind the fact that about 60% of the Iranian women wore the veil even before the revolution. The fact that sociologists actually tell you that when the veil became compulsory, a large number of women who were wearing it and who had been snubbed and always viewed as lacking intellectually, they blended in the society. Now, I'm against making it compulsory. I'm against making any outfit a constitutional mandate. But what I'm telling you is that factually speaking, you cannot say that the veil robs women of their individuality, because a lot of them wear it happily. There were a lot of them, and then there are the upper layer of the upper classes who I'm sure in areas oppose it, and that's true too. But you cannot, generalize that to, if you go by percentage, the majority, the number of people, those who wear it happily, I can tell you even without doing a systematic study, there cannot be less than those who are happy, just by sheer practice of the veil before the revolution and after the revolution. And besides, your individuality, any person's individuality, depends on many things. We don't hear a word about how much money women earn, what percentage of them went to university, what were the legal rights. For example, what percentage of the Iranian parliament was women? I bet many people don't know that the Iranian parliament has almost the same percentage of women as the American parliament. Iranian parliament has close to 20%, 19% women, which is much higher than the Turkish parliament, for example, which has 11.5%. But you don't think that. I mean, to me, it's much more important to know about women's economic independence and ability to be in the parliament and so on, than what kind of clothes they wear, or whether they are allowed to have makeup or not. Now, again, it doesn't mean that I agree with compulsory clothing, but what I'm saying is that there are far more important issues to pay attention to. And also, the historical context. Why? It's almost none, just one or two cases where there's a reference to their father's problems as a mayor of Tehran, that we hear some things about the previous regime. But it almost seems like people went crazy because they wanted to be religious and fanatic, and no social, real concrete reason for the revolution. Now, if you want to know how the subject is cropped, what you get as really only a part of the reality, the cover of the book is a very good example, because that is from this picture. An Iranian sociologist accidentally found this picture. These two women are actually two activists who work for the election of Mr. Fatemeh here. And they're looking at the newspaper because the results of the election are coming out. And they want to know if their candidate won or not. But what we see here is only their heads in headscarf. And I know that we believe that we should not judge a book by its cover. But believe me, in this case, the cover is very expressive. And that is why I put on the cover of my book what I did, which I will show you in a minute. I just want to have a quick summary. And by the way, I won't talk more than 50-55 minutes, and hopefully we'll have the chance to exchange. So, but basically, by the time you've read the book, you've seen that image and so on. These are the things that you already believe. Muslim women don't have any opportunity in Iran. It would this to be the case for intellectual growth. Their lives are taken over by tragedy. They're discouraged from reading literature. I mean, these are actual concrete things that come out of the book. A student says, it says to the teacher about her classmates, these girls have never been told they're any good. You know? And literature has no merit in our culture. This is really the funniest quote from the book. Because in Iran, you can avoid anything, you cannot avoid literature. People just love it. You get into a taxi and the taxi driver will be reciting Omar Khayyam. I mean, not everyone is a scholar of literature. I'm not making that claim. But people's lives are intertwined with literature. So to say that, you know, we have to read Lolita, and believe me, I have nothing against Nabokov. In fact, I like some of his works. But to kind of present the Iranian culture as if it didn't have literature, and literature had no merit in our culture, and, you know, Nabokov had to go to the rescue, is quite interesting in itself. And so, since these women have no voice, they don't have their own literature, they're told they're no good, they have no opportunities, their voices has to be brought to the humanitarian court in which Nafisi and others like her have their testimony. Now, this is why I put this picture on the cover of my book. These are two women who were demonstrating in front of Tehran University in 2005. So they exist, and all of them is on the cover. They hold two interesting signs. This sign reads, "We women demand equal rights." So obviously they do have demands and grievances. It's not to say that everything is perfect. And her sign reads, "Injustice to women equals injustice to human society." So they're out there demonstrating, and they've done so all the way to the revolution. They've received different reactions and receptions. And under Ahmadinejad, it's been less reception than under Fatemeh. But nonetheless, the Iranian women's movement is among the most vibrant and thriving social movements, social political movements in Iran. And they have no idea what to do with it. People who oppose it have absolutely. This is a coalition of right, left, and center, of religious and secular, and it's just a very, very active. It has young feminist high school students to much, much older religious women, and they are demanding amendments to all kinds of laws and regulations. And I can tell you they won't get it, because they've been getting a lot of very important things over the past many, many decades. The point is not, in my opinion, that we should not talk about it or we should not sympathize with them, but what's important to me is, and to many of us, I think, and it should be to even people who are not living there with them, is to get a real idea of what's going on there, with all kinds of diversity of good and bad, and of, you know, negative and positive, and so forth. Once George Orwell said, "The language has been totally co-opted by politics." He said that, you know, I don't think he has an essay called English and Politics and English Language. I'm sure many of you have read it. He said that these expressions like democracy, they have become like prefabricated hen houses that dominate every sentence, every debate. So my problem was how to speak about what's going on in that society so that I would give a fair and complex representation of that society, and my debate would not be dominated by these prefabricated houses, these, you know, pre-made expressions, you know, extremists, fundamentalists, Muslim women, the Sharia, you know, they just all these really prefabricated concepts that suffocate the sentence. You can't say anything after that. And what I needed was alternative stories, I needed delight and surprise, depth, something that I could, with which I could convey depth and nuance and color and texture, and I really needed to give voice to these women, rather than sit on judgment of who they are and basically decide that they're helpless. So, we could do a lot of things, and I'm going to end in the maybe next 7, 8, 10 minutes or so at most by telling you what I was doing. Well, what we do, we have to bring those voices over into our culture. If we really want to have a story of the world which gets constantly renewed and refreshed and gives us a sense of the vibrancy and reality of life in those cultures. Of course, translations. We have to do translation to the best of our ability all the time. I think we academics who are funded by great institutions and do our we have to do these translations. But the truth is, if the culture of our academia and our society is not aware of the world, our translations will go to waste. If you don't know, there is a Fatemeh in Iran who writes some of the most daring poetry you've ever heard. You might teach a course on world literature, but you won't even know that there is a great translation of Fatemeh poetry in English called Fatemeh Keshavarz. And you can actually use it in your world literature class. So translation by itself, in my opinion, will not do the whole trick. What you need to do, or what we need to do, is bringing these voices over by grafting them on our own voices, where we have the opportunity to bring their voices to our American readership. And so with that in mind, what I did in my book was, yes, I'm using the form of a memoir, but in my memoir, I speak with the voices of these people, or at least I do my best to speak with the voices of those people. Yes, I'm still the one who chooses, so it's still my perspective. I'm very, very aware of it. But I try to import those voices, and I think the best I can do is to give you some examples. This is from Fatemeh. Yeah, she died before the revolution, but actually there are tons of people who were there after the revolution. And by the way, after the revolution, to this day, she's a bestseller. You pick any of her books, they have reached 18th, 20th, 25th edition. They come out in 10,000 copies each. So it's easily read by hundreds of thousands of people to this day. She doesn't have a picture with a headscarf on because she lived before the revolution. These pictures appear on the cover of her book. She was beyond government criticism and the law. So, in other words, such an articulate voice and person existed right there and then when FEC wrote her book. And we don't even get her name in her book. Now, let me just give you a few minutes of what I mean by grafting her voice on my own and bringing it to you. It's page 39. I would like to think that I found my best friend through Fatemeh. It was in the early days of September, when the Iranian academic year begins. My middle school friends had dispersed into different high schools. I was finding my way around and trying to get an idea of what it meant to study literature as seriously as befitted a high schooler. One day, I walked into class after a recess period and found a famous line of Fatemeh, also the title of one of her last long poems written on the book. Let us have faith in the beginning of the cold season. This is a beautifully crafted and complicated poem in which Fatemeh weaves a tapestry of hope and despair, a mosaic of life. The cold season signals the beginning of the end. The wind is blowing, the winter is coming, and she fears she will never feel warm again. Still, she finds a way of reimagining herself, equipped to deal with the approaching harsh seasons. I will abandon old lines and the habit of counting with numbers. I will leave the geometric confines of shape to roam the sensual expanses of vastness. I am naked, naked, naked. Like silences in between passionate words, I am naked, and all my wounds have been inflicted by love. 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 This wandering island I have rescued from the storm in the ocean and carried through volcanic eruptions. Falling apart. Falling apart was the secret of the unified existence of whose most meager pieces assembled. I do not know if at 16 I understood what exactly that falling apart was. I do not know if I understand it fully now. But the poem was elegant, mysterious, full of wonderful images and delicious to the tongue. I read these poems to my then 50-something father, who was not just literary-minded, but fully seasoned in traditional Persian poetry. It was a source of great pride for me to have personally converted him into a fan of Fatemeh. The woman is a grand poet, he would exclaim simply, and I knew that he would not bestow that title easily on anyone. I also, in that same chapter, talk about my high school, I talk about what I did later, I talk about a difficult divorce I went through, but I come back to Fatemeh's voice, how she is also a political figure. You know, she is under, she has another long poem called The Jeweled Land, and she constantly makes fun of the ideology, the grand narrative, by the way, under the Shah, that it was great Iranians with this amazing civilization, and we were going to find our way back to greatness. And then the society was going through incredible consumerism, and you know, so she gives her social commentary. Oh, how comfortable I am in the arms of the motherland, the pacifier of the glorious historical past, the lullaby of civilization and culture, the rattling noise of the ratchet of law. Oh, how comfortable I am. And then she goes on to say, you know, don't infantilize me. You know, allow me to be just the ordinary person with, like any other person in the world, with all the good and bad things that everyone has. And so her poetry has many, many dimensions to it. In fact, there's a very strong spiritual dimension also. But she has her perception of what that spirituality is about. And I would like to finish with one other piece, because right at the time that Nafisi writes her reading Lolita in Tehran, there is a great Iranian writer who lives in Iran called Shahrush Parsi-Pur. Now there are so many. When I go back to Iran, the novel, not short story and novel, is taken entirely by women, almost entirely, 85% by women. I don't even have the time to read them in time, let alone write enough criticism of that. But at the time when Parsi-Pur is writing there, when Nafisi is writing